Wow, we've come a long way. In this video, we'll be exploring function calling in Gemini, which is a feature that allows Gemini to trigger an external function in your code base. Think about situations where you don't want Gemini to make assumptions of the solution, and you could provide a function that maybe, for example, calls out an external database to get information, and Gemini can then enrich its response with that external information, and then you can provide the response to the user. As usual, the code will be available in the description. Please download it and try it out. Don't just watch these videos. Try it out yourself because that's how it's going to stick. And please, if there's anything you don't understand, please leave a comment in the comment section. I'll do my best to explain it. Let's dive into the video.
Hey guys, welcome back. And in this video, we'll be covering function calling in Gemini. This is going to be a very long video, so I'll leave timestamps down below. Please go to anywhere where you specifically want to gain the knowledge, or I would also suggest you could even watch this on 2x speed at the start and then come back and watch each section of the video that you want to gain understanding of. But let's get straight into the video. So as usual, guys, all the resources will be provided in the link in the description. Please click it and run this notebook yourself. For resources, we'll be relying heavily on the examples and the diagrams in the Gemini documentation because I found that this is really good, and we'll just be going through the what, why, and how function calling works, some limitations and best practices, and also just a quick recap and some conclusion. So, what is function calling? As we all know, models are trained on enormous amount of data, but the problem is data continues to grow big, and there is no way that you could continuously train models on the existing data, because today alone we are producing petabytes of data as humans. And so function calling is one of the ways that gives models two things: one, access to more data, and two, ability to take action on either those data or on systems. So I put here, this gives models the ability to interact with external tools, services, in order to augment their responses based on real data. If you've watched the previous videos in this playlist, we have covered search grounding with Google and context searching, which is another type of grounding. And to me, I see function calling as another form of grounding, but instead of using built-in tools from Gemini to achieve this, we define our own function signature and how the model should use it, and provide this function to the model for it to use. Now, why? Without function calling, models would only be able to provide responses but not act. But now we could have models take actions and provide responses based on those actions. And this is useful for augmenting knowledge to produce better results. Say, for example, you have an external system that contains data in your database, but you want Gemini to always use this data to respond to client queries. And so what you could do is that you could define a function that gives Gemini access to the database. Say, for example, you define a get user information, you define a get product function, and then Gemini could then call this function whenever a user asks, what are the products you have in your store? And Gemini calls this function, and then you execute the function, because that's very important. And then you provide the response back to Gemini, and Gemini can then answer the query, right? This is one of the abilities that function calling enables models to do. You also want Gemini to take actions and bring about interactivity in your application. Now, how would you do function calling? The first thing you have to do is you have to define the function signature based on an OpenAI specification, because OpenAI, if I know wrong here, pioneered function calling in models. And so there is a specification I will show you. And the next thing is you provide a function to the model by configuring clients and tools. 3, you register the function by creating a request. 4, you check if the model made any function call. Very important, because you registering a function does not guarantee that the model uses it except you configure it. And 5, you use the result of the function call to display results. Let me show you a diagram from the Gemini docs that put this very clearly. So your application, you have your prompt and your function definition. You send out to Gemini. Gemini, based on the prompt and the function declaration or definition, decides how to respond, either to call the function or not to call it. Gemini does this. The final answer is sent back to the application, but You also pass the response and the execution of the function, right? And then you pass the function name and the argument. Gemini sends this back to you. You pass your prompt and the result of the function call. I don't think I explained that well, so let me cover it again. You have your prompt, you have the function definition, you register it to Gemini. Then the final answer is a completion request. Then you have your function name and your argument. If Gemini decides to call this function, it sends it back to you. You use the prompt, you execute the function, and then you pass the prompt and the result of the execution of the function back to Gemini. Gemini decides what to respond with. Say you've passed the result of the execution and you pass your prompt, Gemini then gives you a final answer, and that is the completion. These are two scenarios, right? The first scenario is where Gemini did not call the function, but the second scenario is where Gemini called the function and then you execute the function. This is what the diagram is just showing you, right? Because here we decide if we're going to execute it or not. Here we did not execute it, but here we executed it, right? So that is how function calling works. But let's look at a quick example. So based on the OpenAI specification, you need a name, you need a description, you need parameters, and in the parameters you specify the type, the properties, and then you also specify the required field. This is just generally the open API specification, right? But this is also something called people call OpenAI specification because they're one of the people's pioneered function calling. And here we create a function named create by chart. We create a description. Descriptions always make your description very, very clear so Gemini knows the functions and what they do. And then we specify that we will provide a title, the label, and the values, and we require these fields. And then you configure the clients and the tools. We specify a types of tool. If you've watched the video in the playlist on Google search or URL context, you will know that we create a tool using this signature, and then we also create a config where we add this tool to the config. And then all we just do is we send a request to Gemini, create a batcher titled quarterly sales with data, this, and then we need to check if Gemini actually makes a function call, and then we check if the response includes a function call. What we do is then we would then create, like, call this create by chat function. Now this is commented out because, like I said, we're using the code in the documentation. This is where you have your create batched function, and then you just call the arguments that Gemini calls, and then the result, and then you get your result, and then you print it. Otherwise, if Gemini did not make a function call, you won't see anything, and then you just print the result. Here we see that Gemini successfully executes the create batched function, and all we just need to do is execute the function, pass it the result and the argument. Now, that's just a very quick example. Let's go into detail. How do you declare a function? You declare a function by specifying what the model can control, and you specify just like a JSON field, right? And then you then create the function. This is the function that will be executed. And if you notice here that the parameters that you specify correspond to the argument that will be passed to the function. So we have the brightness and the color temperature, and then we just say it's going to return a dictionary or string, and then we just add some doc string, and this is how you create a function. And what would then happen is, using this specification here, we create a tool, and we declare the function declarations, set light value declaration, and we specify the config, and then we create our prompt, we pass it the type row user, turn on the light, and then we send the request using all the configs that we've configured, and then we print if to see if Gemini made the function call. If Gemini actually made the function call, what we then need to do is execute the function. So we get the function call that Gemini made, and then we check if tool.name is setLight. All we need to do is then call the setLight function, execute the tool, and get the result and print the result. That is how it works. But this is just half of the pie, because fine, you execute the function, but the user is not getting the result. So what you then need to do is take the results of the function execution and then pass it back to Gemini. Now, so the way to do this is you basically have to extract the function response that we got of Gemini's execution, and that's what we do here. And then to the previous content that we created, we append the content, the previous content, right? Append the content from the model's response, and then we also append the function response, and we then create a new request to Gemini using all the content, and that should basically give us the results. of our query. Now, Gemini also ships with the ability for you to parallelly execute different functions instead of executing individual functions. For example, we have a function declaration of power disco ball, we have another function declaration of start music, and another one of dim light. And we want Gemini to execute all these functions at once. And the way to do this is we'll provide these functions to Gemini for it to execute, and then we create a config. And the important thing here is that we set the automatic function calling and we set it to disabled. What this does is that it forces the model to call any function instead of chatting, meaning that Gemini, in this diagram I showed you previously, instead of Gemini deciding whether it will call a function or it won't call a function, what we're doing here is that it forces Gemini to actually call the function. It will skip this step, or this step won't be a valid step for it, and instead is always going to go here. And this ensures that it does not decide, it just executes all the functions available to it. And then when we execute this, and then you provide all the tools to Gemini. And then here, this is the important part. We are doing two things here. First, we are disabling automatic function calling. This is only available in Gemini's Python SDK. I would explain what automatic function calling in a second. Please just ignore this for now. But here, we tell Gemini that it must use the functions that we've provided. And what this does is that if I go back to this diagram, we see here for every function definition and prompt, Gemini has a decision where it can either call or execute the function, or it could just provide an answer to you. But what we're doing here is we are ensuring that it always calls the functions and it does not decide, or it doesn't try to chat. And right, the way you do that is by configuring the function calling mode, and we specify it as any. There are three types. I will explain those three types in a second, but let's just continue to go through this tutorial. And so we create a new chat request and send the request to Gemini, and we tell it turn this place into a party. And what Gemini is going to do is look at all the functions and execute every one of them. And so what it does is that it prints every function call, right? Asks the join, blah blah blah. And here we see that Gemini basically starts the music, powers the disco ball, and dims the light with specific arguments. And here, once we've sent that request, we then try to see if Gemini actually executed any of those functions. And what happens is that here, Gemini, we see successfully executed all the functions, and it passed all the arguments like loud true, energetic true, power disco ball true, dim light, and set the brightness to 0.5. And previously, I mentioned here that we're disabling automatic function calling, but let's quickly go through what automatic function calling is in the next section. So guys, as we saw previously, it is a tedious process of function calling where you have to declare the function or define it, you have to register it, you have to have Gemini call the function, and then you have to execute the function yourself and then pass the response back to Gemini. This is a very tedious process, but in Python, we have the ability for us to have automatic function calling. This is where instead of us having to execute the function, Gemini will be able to run this function and then pass the response back to the model and use it to satisfy the user's query. And here I put, it is a feature that allows the model to execute the function and use the response of the function execution to produce an output back to the user. So instead of having to execute the function ourselves and pass the response back to the model, this is handled by the model. And this is only supported in the Python SDK. And this happens because we automatically convert the function declarations, and Gemini handles the function call execution and the response cycle for you. And one of the example is this disco example here that we previously had here, and I'll show you. We define all our functions rather, and then we make these functions available to Gemini as a tool, and then we make the request, right? And all that is happening here is that it will automatically handle the definition of the function, the execution of function, the calling of the function, and then passing the response back to the model. Why this is happening is that here, all we just did was create a function signature. We didn't need to define it using the OpenAPI spec. We just created function signature and then we registered it, and we did not importantly disable this. So this is how it will work by default, but if you didn't want this, you would have had to disable this in the config, but we didn't disable this, and that is why by default Python SDK ships with automatic function calling if you define your function this way, right? That is the power of Gemini function calling in Python SDK, which is why I really like working with Gemini in Python. Now we're going to discuss something. So now we're going to look at composition function calling, which is another powerful feature of function calling in Gemini that allows Gemini to sequentially execute different functions and then use the response from those function execution into a single response and then provide it back to you. I put it, it's a process where Gemini can sequentially execute functions and then chain responses from those individual functions calls to return an output. You enable this through the prompt you provide to Gemini. Your prompts are so important, guys. Your prompts are so important. Say, for example, you have these two functions, get weather forecast and set thermostat temperature. We provide these functions to Gemini for it to be able to call and execute, and we use automatic function calling here. And in our prompt, this is the most important thing, we specify like a conditional statement. If it is warmer than 20 degrees in London, set the thermostat to 20 degrees, otherwise set it to 18 degrees. And from the prompt alone, what Gemini is going to do is Gemini is going to first execute the get weather forecast function, and based on the response that is returned, it is then going to set the thermostat, right? We see here that we didn't need to first say, oh, first call the get weather function, then we get the response, pass it back. Here instead, by our prompting technique and also by automatic function calling in Gemini, in the Python SDK, don't forget, we are able to have Gemini call all the functions we have and then use the response from those individual execution to satisfy our query, right? And here we see, if we call this, it first calls the get weather forecast, it gets the response, it then calls the set function, and then it gets the response, it then returns back us a successful response. Previously, I mentioned that there are three function calling modes, and they are auto. This is where Gemini decides if it's going to execute a function or it's just going to do chatting. We have any. This is where you tell Gemini that it must call all the functions that you've provided it, and this is none, which is what Gemini shoots by default if you don't specify any tool for it to use. Now, I'm just quickly going to cover model context protocol. As we know, MCP is a standardized protocol that lets AI models to connect to external systems through a unified interface, and it enables consistent, secure, and structured exchange of data, context, and actions between models and tools. Gemini has the ability for it to also execute MCP servers or MCP functions, but this is not currently supported extensively in Gemini and is still being worked on, so it's an experimental feature, which is why I'm not really covering it here. This has been a really long tutorial, but let's quickly go through the limitations. Don't forget, you have to define clear functions with correct signatures because the model uses this to decide what function to call. You have to specify a clear name with no space dashes. You have to limit to calls to either 10 or 20 to ensure that Gemini is not overwhelmed with the available tools or functions you have. Say, for example, you are building a spot research tool and you want Gemini to use a spot research tool. You can then specify in the prompt that you are a spot researcher if you have a spot tool. You also provide explicit instructions on when to use functions. Ensure you handle errors gracefully. Gemini does not do this, and so you have to ensure you are handling the function execution errors. And security is your concern. If you have a function, ensure that it is secure and is not exposing data that you don't want Gemini to have access to. And every function declaration with their input arguments all count towards the input token. And you should not always assume that every function executes successfully. You should check this before using the function, and you can check this using the finish using object model in the response. Automatic function calling is only allowed in Python, like I said, and function calling with thinking is enabled by default, and you can check this through a thought signature that is available on the model's response. And I put here, a thought signature is an encrypted representation of the model's internal thought process that you pass back to the model on subsequent turns. This is automatically handled for you. You don't need to do this, but if you wanted to see how you could manually do this yourself, you could check the documentation here that discuss function calling with thinking. I won't cover that because again, this is by default handled for you. Just for a recap, we covered function calling, what it is. We saw how to define a function and register the function. We saw how to send requests to the model. We saw how you could check for execution of the function. We saw how to handle parallel function execution. We saw how to handle automatic function calling in Gemini, which if you don't declare the function and you just define it, is automatically handled for you. We saw how to do compositional function calling for sequential execution and chaining responses in Gemini. We saw the different function calling mode, and also we also covered briefly model context protocol And these are building blocks that you will come back to again and again when working with Gemini function calling capabilities. If you made it to this part of the video, this was a really long one, guys. You are the special people. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And if you like the video, please like it, share it with a friend, subscribe and turn on post notification. If there's anything you didn't understand, please leave a comment. I will gladly explain it again, and I'm sure anyone else watching could also help. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.